So we will continue from what we stopped in yesterday, which is, well, we had our very first program in C, which is hello world, and we converted this to Python, right? And we have found that, well, what is the main basic form of a program in C? We must have a main, and then, well, some of the syntax issues. You must finish every sentence in C with a semicolon. You must define variables before you use them. And how can you use some of the standard library functions? And we have used printf as an example of that. Good. So this is what we have done yesterday. And by the way, I have uploaded all the videos to the Avenue channel. And by the way, also someone kind of highlighted that the outline had the wrong year in the title page. So thanks for the observation. I have updated this already. But anything else in the outline document is in fact reflecting what we have in this year, as far as I can tell. But for today's topic, so let's build on top of what we have done yesterday. So we have wrote a very simple program. We're going to extend it a little bit today. So, well, we have output, we did output something on the screen using printf. What if we want to read something from the screen, right? Take something as an input from the user. Well, in Python, it's quite simple because we can just say input and then you ask the user to input something and then you will read it and then you will print it. Good. So if I look into this Python program, and it's very important that I'm really using this Python thing because first of all, this is what we have covered in first year, but also it reflects some of the fundamental differences between C and Python. What do I mean by this? For example, if you look into the variable num, well, you have used it really without defining it in Python, correct? So I didn't really say what is the type of the num. So if the user inputs anything, here I'm saying please integer, input integer, but what if the user inputed something like a string or a float or double floating point? Would Python kind of complain about it? Well, no, because num here has no type yet. So it gets the type on the fly, correct? This is not the case for C, as you will see right now. And also, if you look into the input function in Python, in fact, it does two things, not just one, right? Can someone highlight really what are these two things that the input function in Python is doing in this line? Yeah. Exactly, thank you. So it's doubling, in fact, a printf, like you give the user a message and then you read something from the user. These are two completely different tasks, right? One of them is outputting something to the screen, and the other one is reading from. The input function is doing both, right? And then after you read the integer, you print it using the print function in Python as well. But if you go to C bar, well, it's completely different. First of all, I have to define my structure correctly. Like I should define the main function as we have learned yesterday. It takes no input parameters, so it takes void, and it returns integer, which is the new with correct operation. And then the difference, or the important difference that I was highlighting here, is that you have to define the num type before using it, right? This is a rule that you must follow in all your C++ programs. But in fact, most of the non-scripting programming languages, because they are called strict type, which means every variable has a certain type that it cannot really change on the fly. Good. So I define num be int here, and then, well, I cannot couple print and reading from the screen in C. It's not like Python. We have two separate functions for this. What you do is you first print that you want to tell the user, please input something. So this is an output. So you print integer, enter an integer, and then you read it. Printf we have seen yesterday, but that scanf, this is the first time you see it. What does it do? Well, from the name, this is printing to the screen, this is scanning the screen. So it's the function that is responsible for reading the input that the user will enter into the screen or into the console. Good. How does it work? Well, it's not as simple as in Python. Again, it has a certain format. It's quite more complex than the printf, because in the printf, you are not reading something back. You are just kind of splitting a string on the screen. We will see right now that we can also format it. So printf can be more complex, but in this simple format, it's just really a string between two double quotes, and that's it. In the scanf, Well, I need to say what is the type of the thing that I'm reading right now. And I need to pass the variable that I'm going to override with this value. This is really what it means. It means I want to read something from the screen, and I will tell you what %d means right now. But then this thing, this value, for example, if the user input 10, is going to be stored in num, which is the variable I defined here. Good. So this is really the meaning of this. Why do we have this and in front of the variable? We'll discuss this in more detail later on. But the basic meaning here is I want to override num. Right? To understand this, go back to the definition of the function when we discussed main yesterday. I told you that main takes input parameters, correct? That it can use in its own function, but because we don't pass anything to this main, it's just void. Usually, all the functions in C follow the same approach. So here, for example, this integer and enter an integer is an input string that I pass as an input variable to the printf function. Good. In the scanf, how many parameters does it take? Now 2, right? One of them is the format, and we will learn more about this later on, but it means that I need to read an integer, basically. And the second one is what is the variable that we want to store the value in, which is num. But because this is an input parameter to a function, by default, if you pass input parameters to functions, you don't want to modify them, right? So you just pass them to read them. But here I want to pass num to modify it. This is the meaning of this reference. It's called the reference operator, or AND. It means I'm passing this num. It's called pass by reference. Forget about the name now. We have one lecture for it. But just the basic meaning is I'm passing num as an input parameter, but in fact, it works as if it's an output, right? Because this is in fact the return value from the scanf that you updated the num variable with the new value that the user used. Good. And then once I read this value in num, I'm just printing it back to the screen, which is doing the print in the Python example. Well, I'm adding a new line, and then the square of this value is this value, and then num. Now, this printf is completely different than this one, right? Here, it was only a single input parameter, just passing a message to the user. Here, what does this mean? Well, it means multiple things. Some of them are basic, some of them are advancing. Let's focus about the basic ones first. The basic ones are how many input parameters printf now has? 1, 2, 3, right? The first one of them is, again, the format of the message that I want to print, right? I want this to start with a new line, and then it has a string that's called the square of something that doesn't make sense now is another thing that doesn't make sense, and then add a new line. And then I'm passing two variables, the num and, well, num square. Can anyone guess from this kind of syntax really what's going to happen? Did you guys deal with regx in Python? Like with regular expressions? If you want to format a complex message, did you see this in the first year Python course or not? Yeah. Oh, it's either yes or no. It's your answer. Yes, did you see it? No? Okay. Can anyone get what is happening here?
One by one with the parameter after.
Exactly, thank you. So simply what does it do is I want to print something to the user. Like think from the end user, right? The end user is expected to see the output as, well, the square of num, for example, if I input 10 here, the square of 10 is 100, right? This is really what I'm expecting to see. But because the message itself is not static, it depends on what value the user inputs. So I need some placeholders, right? I cannot really say the square of 10 is 100. And I cannot write the code that looks into every single number in the integer values and do it square. It's very tedious and in fact almost impossible. So you want something that is dynamic enough to have placeholders, and this word is very important, to have placeholders in your output message that are going to be replaced with whatever value you want, right? So this is the general format of a printf. Is I have a general format of a message, and I have some templates or placeholders in between that I'm going to fill in with values. So as your friend said here, the square of this first placeholder of %d is going to be overwritten by the num, right? So the actual message would be the square of the value of the num. In our example, it was 10 is, and then this is the second value here. going to be replaced. And printf is going to do this for you. Good. Does this make sense? Yeah, please go.
I didn't think Canada, the university, and then wherever you
Yeah.
It's the how it like it is like a general placeholder for people.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a more of a detailed question of what are really these placeholders. There are different placeholders for different types, as we will learn later on. %d is more like d for decimal, which means you are expecting an integer value, right? Like an int. And we have another one for float, another one for characters. But here it means I'm expecting an integer. And then this placeholder, as you said here, is going to scan any, it's going to scan the screen for an integer value and then put it in the number. So the direction of the scanf is you are reading from the screen or the console and updating your value. The direction of the printf is the other way around. In fact, I have variables, and I'm going to overwrite my placeholders in the message of the screen because I want to print to the screen, right? So here, this kind of placeholder is to read from the console and update your variable, while this placeholder in the printf is going to read the value of the variable and place it on the screen. Good. But generally, yes, that's the general format of printf and scanf. In fact, they have the similar kind of input structure. Is that generally you have a formatted message, a number of placeholders, a number of input parameters that are going to be either written to these placeholders for the case of printf or read from the placeholders for the case of the scanf. Does this make sense? Yeah.
So if the first scanf scans the screen for a character and listen it, what if it finds the word you want?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. In our case here, is going to read the first one, ignore the remaining. If you want to read more integers, then you should format your message in that case. For example, here I wanted to print 2 integers. So I already had 2% Ds, right? So if I want to read 2 integers from the user, and we will try these things later on for a more detailed example, you should have as many %Ds as the number of integers you want to read. Yeah. Sorry, can you see this again?
For the printf statement worked out, we didn't have the added sign, which.
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. Thanks. So do you remember that when I said for the scanf, the reason for this and I called it the pass by reference operator is that I want to update num. So I'm passing num as an input parameter, but in fact it works as if it's an output parameter because its value is going to be modified. Well, let's go through this. I define num here, but I didn't give it a value, right? Assume I initialize it with 0. So num value here is 0. Then later on for the scanf, the user inputs 10. After this line, what would be the value of num? Or what is the value that I want num would hold? 10. Because I want num to read whatever is in the screen. So I want to overwrite num. This is the reason for this and thing. Right? For now, because again, we have a separate lecture for this one. But for the case of the printf, assume that, well, num now is 10. After I execute the printf, what will be, or what is the value that I want num to hold? Still 10. I don't want to modify num in this case. I only want to print it. This is why we didn't have the and. Because you are passing it only for read. So for now, think of this and as if I'm passing something for write. Right? Is that good? Yep.
But in final, what if we have like 3 placeholders, but only 2 of them?
Yeah, that's also a good question. And this is one of the things that we can try on online VDB. Well, it's going to complain. That's a syntax error. So, and this is the advanced. So at the beginning, I said this kind of format of scanf and printf, they have some basic kind of things what we're discussing right now, but there is an advanced concept behind this. Because if you really think carefully about this, what is printf? Printf is nothing other than a function, right? But I'm passing in parameters too. But up until now, most of you are used to functions that take a fixed number of input parameters, right? Based on how it's being defined, right? But right now, it seems that the printf function is in some cases taking 1 variable. Here it's taking 3. In other cases, it might be taking 4 or 5, right? So it takes a dynamic number of input parameters. So this is an advanced concept of programming, which is a function that is able to take a variable number of input parameters based on the use case, right? How does printf really know? How does the actual implementation of printf know how many variables to expect from the number of placeholders you have in your message? So really what happens behind the scene, if you look into the printf implementation, is I first scan my first input parameter, which is a must because this is your format. I know based on the placeholders how many variables I should expect. And those number of variables is the number of remaining input parameters I should expect. So for example, as a compiler, I'm scanning this one. I'm finding that here I have this and this is 2. So I'm going to read another 2 input parameters. In your example, if this was 3, but I only had 2, so the compiler will say, yeah, scan this 1, 2, 3. I read 1. I read the second. Oh, there is no third one. That's a syntax error. The compiler will fail. Good. Is there any other question?
One variable repeated multiple times, we still have to have the same parameter over and over again.
So you want to print the same variable like again and again and again?
Yeah.
Although this is kind of a fictitious thing because why do you want to do this? But yes, I mean, the compiler really doesn't know what is this variable, right? The compiler is dumb, right? It just deals with things as based on rules. So the rules are, as I was explaining right now, number of placeholders and number of input parameters. What is the actual input parameter here? It doesn't really matter. Is it num? So for example, here I can say just say num and num. Just the same thing because the syntax is the same. What is the actual value? This depends on the logic of the program you are writing, right? But that's not the smartest way of doing it. For example, if you want to print num 100 times, why do I have like 100 number of input parameters? I can write a for loop, right? And print num 100 times, right? Are we good? These are all excellent questions, so I'm happy receiving them. And if you have more questions, please ask. Good. So this is basically saying what we have discussed already. Every variable must be declared. There is a definition of a variable, and we have a separate detailed lecture for variables. We went through the scanf, and here we are explaining this and num thing, which means batch by reference. We want to update it. And then here I'm showing you some of those conversion specifiers or placeholders. We have seen already the %d, which is for integer. If I want to read a character, %c, float, %f, double is %lf, which means it's long float. Well, where should I obtain the full list of this? Well, from the C kind of programming language definition. So if you open something like C reference or basically printf definition of the actual standard library of C, it gives you the full list of these specifiers, right? It tells you what is the meaning of every one of them. But these are the most commonly used ones. Okay. And both apply for scanf and printf. They're the same thing. Okay. And by the way, printf is later on when we go to C++. For those of you that know C++, usually people use C in and C out, which is another kind of format of reading and writing from the screen. But printf is usually used more than the C in and C out, even in C++. And the reason is very powerful, right? The rules we have given right now allows you to format any message you are looking for with any number of input parameters, and it covers what we call regular expression formats, which is something agnostic to the programming language. Regular expression is simply something that defines what text is in a more generic way. For example, is it numerical? Is it alphabetical? Are there special characters? Are they decimals, right? So if you look for regular expressions, it applies for any kind of programming language, and it's very important for text processing, machine learning, etc. So printf is more suitable there than CN and Cout. Good. One related point to printf, and this is more related to the lab. If you try to do printf or scanf in Eclipse, which is our IDE, Eclipse is not very well aligned with the printf because it has a problem with the streaming buffer. So the way the compiler or the way the IDE deals with the screen, we said not yesterday, we said in the first lecture that basically the screen is nothing other than an input-output one. It's an output device. But if you input something to the console through the keyboard, so it's an input device, right? So these are input-output devices, which means you need to deal with the I/O drivers. The way Eclipse does it, defines a buffer, everything you want to write there, so it adds to the buffer and then writes to this device. Eclipse has a problem with these buffers, so it doesn't really work very well with printf and scanf. So if you try it on your own and you see that it doesn't really print what you're expecting, it might not be you have a problem with the program, it might be just really Eclipse problem. So don't worry about printing something or scanning something from Eclipse. The good thing is that in all our labs, You are not required. In fact, you are encouraged not to try to print anything or scan anything from the console. Because again, we have the unit testing environment, which is, it's the way that you are going to interface with your own programs. So it's like a test bench, which means I feed data to my program through the unit testing, and I read data from my program through the unit testing. This is why you don't need printf and scanf in our labs, and don't try to use them. Good.